Okay.
Welcome, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So this we're still discussing the whole business of temple donations, right? And here we're talking about donating a field, right? The value of a field to the temple treasury. And of course, we don't own fields. We don't own real estate. We own the usage of that field. So although if you're one of the people when the land was originally divided up under Joshua and so that it was distributed according to tribes and families within the tribes, and they did everything to try and make sure that the family that had originally inherited that land was able to keep that land. So in that sense, there might be some sense of ownership. But for the most part, it certainly seems to reinforce the idea that you don't really own the real estate. So going on, right? We figured out that a chomer of barley, right? That is, if the field could be sown with a chomer of barley, that was for each chomer of barley, the field could be sold for. It was 50 shekels. It was valued at 50 shekels. That would be the donation you were making. However, there is another consideration. In Mishnat Hayovel Yakdish Sadehu. So if from the year of the Jubilee he should dedicate his field, Ke'er Kachayakum, then it would be evaluated at that amount of a right, that's 50 shekels for a chomer, each chomer of Saorim. Imishnat Hayom Haktish. So Rashi needs to explain what exactly are we talking about. So, Imishi Avrash Nat Hayovel. In other words, the Jubilee year has just passed. Miyad Hiktisha, and then he immediately dedicated his field right after the Jubilee year. Uva Zelagala Miyad. And another person came to redeem the field. In other words, the temporary treasury could sell the field to another person. We've already talked about that. So how much would that person then have to donate to the temple for that field? That would be the amount that we just said. Take a look at Rashi goes on with this. Yeah, ke'er kachayakom. In other words, ke'erech hazeh amor yeh. In other words, according to that 50 shekels per chomer calculation, hamishim kesef yitain. Right, he needs to give 50 shekels for every chomer of barley that the field is able to be sown. Right now, however, ve'im achar hayovel. But if after the jubilee Yaktish Sadehu. This person would dedicate his field. V'chishav lo hakohen et hakesef. The kohen needs to calculate for him the amount of money, silver al pi hashanim, in other words, with respect to according to the years hanotarot that are remaining, ad shnat hayovel, until the Jubilee year. So in other words, if he don't v'nigra me'er kacha, and that would be deducted from the value of the field, right? Because there are going to be fewer harvests. So, for example, if it was 5 years after the Yovel, right, then essentially we'd be talking about that he'd have 44 years of the field to up until the next Yovel, right? So the value of those, and Rashi will tell us exactly, excuse me, how that's going to work out. All right, let's make sure I've got that. Right, okay, here we go. Find the place here. Ve'im achar Yovel, and if after the Jubilee year, Yaktish, he should dedicate. V'chein im hikdisha mishnat Yovel, v'nishtaheh biyad gizbar, right? So in other words, if he dedicated the field from the year of the Yovel, v'nishtaheh biyad nizbar, and it remained under the authority of the treasurer, this is the temple treasurer, uva ze legala achar yovel, and someone else came and to redeem the field, and it was now after the Yovel. So the person dedicated the field. This is talking about a circumstance with where he dedicated the field the year immediately following the Yovel, and it remained in the hands of the temple treasurer for a number of years. And then someone came to redeem the field, to purchase, so to speak, the harvests of the field. V'chishav lo hakohen et hakesef. So the kohen, the gizbar, the treasurer, needs to calculate the amount of money al pi hashanim hanotarot with regards to or according to the number of years remaining. Kifi cheshbon ketzad. So according to a calculation, ketzad. So how do we calculate this formula? Harei tzav damim shel arba'im v'tesha shanim. So we know that for 49 years, the amount that is designated chamishim shekel is 50 shekels. So 49 years, it is worth 50 shekels, again, according to a chomer, right? Hare shekel l'chol shana, right? So we see that it is a shekel for each year, right? V'shekel yeter al kulam, right? So 49 shekels plus a 50th one. So it's 1 shekel for each year, for each of the 49 years. But he has to pay it's got to be worth 50 shekel. So there's another shekel remaining, right? V'ha-shekel, and it turns out that the shekel is worth arba'im ushmona pundionim, that each shekel is worth 48 pundionim, right? Hare sela upundion l'shana. So we can figure that each year, right, for the 49 years, right, since they're 48 pundion to a sela. So each year is 1 sela and a pundion for each year. Ela shechaser pundion echad lekulam. But we notice that there's 1 pundion missing for all the years. For Amrura, so in other words, there's 49, right? There are 49 years, and we're doing a sela and a pundion for each one of those years, right? So that's how it works out to be 49 selas. But there's one additional sela. Remember, it was 50 selas. So we have to figure out. But Ru Rabotenu, and so our rabbis taught us she'oto pundion, that 50th sela, right? Kalbon, or sorry, that additional pundion, forgive me, is a kalbon, is a commission to the money changer, the haba legael, right? Sorry, period. Is kalbon leprot trot, is a commission for the money changer. For haba ligol, right? And so one who comes to redeem it, yiten sela ufundion lechoshana. So that person comes and gives a sela and a pundion for each year, l'shanim hanotarot, for the years remaining until the Jubilee year, ad shnat hayovel. So he said that it has to be reduced from its value, right? In other words, the number of years that has been in the possession of the treasurer have to be reduced from the total amount of the sale. Min yan hashanim, in other words, the number of years shemishnat hayovel, that are from the year of the Jubilee, ad shnat hapidyon, up to the year of the redemption, up until the year of the redemption. Going on, let's make sure we're catching every verse. Okay. Ve'im ga'ol yigal et hasadeh hamakdishoto. And if the one who dedicated the field wants to redeem the field, vayasaf chamishit kesef, he has to add 1/50th of the amount, right, of the money, of the silver. We've already dealt with this additional fifth, which is actually an additional fourth. Erkacha, in other words, of the value alav on it, the kamlo, and it returns back to him. He gets the field back. Sorry, I just want to make sure we have everything right. V'im ga'ol yigal. So if the owner of the field, the original owner of the field, wants to purchase back the field, amakdishoto, in other words, the one who dedicated the field, Yosif chomesh, he needs to add a chomesh al hakitzba hazot on whatever the amount, whatever value the field has at that particular point, right? According to that formula that we read before. Going on. Let's see. But if the original owner doesn't redeem the field, and in fact, if he sold the field to a different person, lo yigael od, it can no longer be redeemed. Let's see what exactly this means. In other words, if the one who originally dedicated the field doesn't redeem it in that period of time, for machar, and if he sold, and the he is not the original owner, it's the gizbar, that is the temple treasurer. So im lo yigal, this is referring to the original owner, and machar is referring to the temple treasurer, right? Et hasadeh ishacher, right? If he sold it now, the temple treasurer, while it's in the possession of the temple, sells it to another person, lo yigael, or it can no longer be redeemed, lashuv biyat hamaktish, in other words, to go back to the original owner. And we have read about this particular concept already, that when you dedicate a field to the temple and you don't choose to redeem it in a certain period of time, it goes either, right, if the temple treasurer doesn't sell it, it remains in the possession of the Kohanim once the Jubilee year occurs. And here we're talking about if the temple treasurer sold it to someone else in that period of time. Going on. So that when the field goes out in the Jubilee year, in other words, from the person who purchased it, Kodesh Lashem, it shall be dedicated to God, Kesadeh HaCherem, like a consecrated field, like as if that field had been consecrated to the temple. La kohen tia achuzato, it shall be a possession for the kohen. It should be his achuzah. It should be his property now. Let's go on here. And again, this is not totally strange to us. We've read about this before in a different kind of context. Right? And the field, when it goes out of the buyer's possession in the Jubilee year, miyad halokho, in other words, from the possession of the one who took the field, min habizbar, from the temple treasurer, just like any field, right? If you sold a field, if Reuven sold a field to Shimon, it was up until the Jubilee year, and then that would be the value of the field, and in the Jubilee year, it would return back to Reuven. That's what he's talking about here. Kodesh Lashem. But in this case, it should be sanctified to God. Lo yashuv lahekdesh bedek habayit, right? Lo sheyashuv lahekdesh bedek habayit liyad hagizbar, right? So it says, interesting, he says, not that it should go back. So lo sheyashuv lahekdesh as a sanctified as a sanctified object for the bedek habayit means it means the improvements of the temple. In other words, bedek habayit was a concept of the need to maintain the temple, leyad hagizbar, in other words, under the temple treasurer, because the temple treasurer was in charge of making sure that the temple was maintained. Ella, but it should be kesadeh hacherem. It should be seen as a field that is consecrated. We'll see what this means. Hanatun lakohanim, which is given now to the priests, not to the temple treasurer. Shinemar, as it states in Numbers 18, Kol cherem b'Yisrael, any consecrated property that was consecrated by an Israelite. L'cha, this is referring to the Kohanim, right? In Numbers, the priests are told this, it shall be to you. Af zu, so this too, this field too, titchalek lakonim, should be divided up for the priests, shel oto mishmar, of that particular watch, right? Remember the 24 watches, sheyom hakippurim shel yovel pogebo, in which Yom Kippur of that Jubilee year occurs. So again, just to review this, right? There were 24 priestly families, and essentially they would serve in the temple for a week at a time. There was a rotation, right? And if the family of that particular rotation were in the week in which Yom Kippur fell, they would receive this field. That's what we're saying here. Any comments before we go on to the next aliyah here? No. Okay. Ve'im et sedei miknato, right? Asher lo misdei achuzato. So yaktish lashem. So now we're talking about a situation where Shimon bought a field from Reuven, and Shimon wants to dedicate it to the temple, right? It's not his field. It's not his original field, right? So here we go. Ve'im sdei miknato. If it was a purchased field, chaluk yesh or chiluk yesh bein sadeh mikneh lesadeh achutazah. So he says we have to make a distinction between a purchased field, stay mikneh, listeh achuzah, as opposed to your inherited field, right? One of the field that was inherited to your family since the times of Joshua. Shesadeh mikneh lo techalek lakonim, because if it is a purchased field, you've purchased this field from someone for whom the field is an inheritance, right? It should not be divided up to the Kohanim Payovel in the Jubilee year. Lefi, because she'eno yachol lahaktisha ela ad hayovel, because in truth he can only dedicate this field until the Jubilee year. Shahare Bayovel, because in fact, of course, Bayovel, in that Jubilee year, Haita Aitida Latzek Miado, he no longer would have that field. Remember, in the Jubilee year, he'd have to give it back to Reuven, Velashuv Lava'alim, and return to its original owners, Lefichach, and for this reason, Imba Laga'ala, if he comes to redeem this field, Bedamim Halalu, right? Through the amount of money, these money, haktsuvim lasadeh achuzah, right? That are figured out in the case of the field that was an inherited field, right? So let's make sure. Okay, yes. Okay. So what it's saying is this: if he wants to redeem it, he has to redeem it, right, according to the same amount of money that were established, right, for a chasdei achuzah. Because again, with the stei akuzah for the inherited field, he figures out, right, according to 49 years, right, up till the Jubilee year, according to that formula that we read. So he's going to have to pay the same amount of money as according to the field, even though it's a purchased field, he uses the same formula. Im lo yigal, but if he does not redeem the field, Vayim karena gizbar la'acher, right? And it turns out that, again, the temple treasurer sells this field to a different person, or im lo yigal hu bishnat hayovel, or if this field is not redeemed in the Jubilee year, Yashuva Sadeh, in that case, the field goes back la'asher kanahu me'oto. It goes back to the person from whom he purchased it. Oto sheik deisha, right. Me'oto kanahe me'ito, oto sheik disha, right. In other words, the person who dedicated the field, that is Shimon, right? He is the purchaser, purchased it from, he purchased it from Reuven. And what we're saying is that it goes back to Reuven. Ufen tomar, and should you say, Lasher kanahu halokeach hazeh hacharon, right? And if you're thinking that it means that in the Jubilee year it goes back to Shimon, right? The person who last purchased it, okay, hazeh hacharon meito, from him, vezehu hagizbar. Okay. So you might think, right? So I'm trying to figure this out, right? So Reuven sells the field to Shimon. Shimon then dedicates the field to the Gizbar, and the Gizbar sells this now to a third person, right? So what we're saying is that if in fact that third person does not redeem the field, we're saying that the field then goes back to the original owner. And what we're saying here is you might think that similarly that it goes back to the Gizbar, right? Vezehu agizbar lechach utzrach. For this reason, hatzrach lomar. The Torah needs to tell us laasher lo achuzat haaretz. It has to be very specific that it goes back to the original owner, to Reuven. It goes all the way back to Reuven. So let's go over this one more time. Reuven sold the field to Shimon. Shimon then dedicates the field, and it now passes over into the hands of the temple treasurer. The temple treasurer then sells the field to a third party, or I guess it would be a fourth party at this point, right? But a non-Kohen. And then the Jubilee year occurs, and Shimon has not redeemed the field. Now we know in a case where Reuven is the one who dedicated the field goes back to the Kohanim if Reuven has not redeemed it. But in this particular case, since Shimon is not the original owner of the field, it does not go back to the Kohanim. It goes back to Reuven. Okay? Miyerushat avot, right? Achuzat haaretz miyerushat avot. In other words, the person, this is talking about Reuven, who owned the land from his ancestors. Vezehu ba'alim harishonim, and this is referring to the original owners, the first owners, shemachruha lamakdish, who sold it to the second person who dedicated the field. And I think I should stop here and hope that if you couldn't understand what I was saying, that you ask me some questions and I can try and answer these questions well. So please forgive me. I have to figure out this. Yes, David.
Yeah, so I'm trying to understand why does Reuven get to benefit, in the last case that you were talking about, the original owner
Yes.
benefits, and it doesn't seem like there's any rationale for why they should benefit, right? The person that dedicated it went to the temple, then they sold it to a fourth party, or as you pointed out, but then it goes all the way back to the original owner, right?
Correct.
So why does the original owner get to benefit in that case?
Well, he benefits in the sense that he did not enter an agreement in which he did not originally dedicate that field to the temple, right? if I'm answering your question properly, we're talking about Shimon who chose to dedicate that field. And so since the ruling goes only for the original owner who dedicated, right? Here he sold it. There was no understanding there that it was going to go to the temple. Shimon got the benefit of that donation. And so that's why in the Jubilee year, when it's supposed to return to the original owners, it returns back to Reuven.
But there are also, in that case, but the other thing I'm thinking of is there could have been like multiple transactions that occurred between Reuven. I mean, there's the most straightforward case between Reuven, Shimon, the temple, and the fourth party. But what
Right.
happens if there was like, I don't know, six owners between, you
Right.
know, then
Right.
then it's still it sounds like it sounds like almost a way that, they're keeping wealth in the family, right? Because, the original owners, under circumstance can get it back, even if it's like, I don't know how many buyers have
That's
gone.
correct. That's
It,
correct. Right. So every time the field is sold, right? So if Reuven sells it to Shimon, and let's say he sells it to him in the year after the Jubilee year. So let's just for argument's sake say he sells it to him for 50 shekels. I mean, he would sell it to him for whatever each year's harvest is worth. Okay. So, and then Shimon has the field for 3 years and then decides to dedicate it to the temple. Well, in that case, the field is worth, 3 years less because it's got three less harvests coming up. Okay. And then the temple treasurer holds it for a couple of years and then sells it to a fourth party, God. Okay, just for example. Okay, and God has now paid less for that, right? Because every time that field is sold, it's a little closer to the next Yovel or further away from the original Yovel, and so that field is worth less every time. So that part of it means that the value of the field, is basically fixed. And I don't know if that makes it, but we do want to try and make sure that the Torah wants to try and make sure that original division of the land under Joshua would remain intact as much as possible. So this is sort of when you dedicate it to the temple, that's what sort of creates an interesting situation. But let's leave the temple out of it for a moment and
yeah.
say that people, Reuven could sell the field to Shimon, Shimon could sell the field to God, God could sell it to Asher within that 50-year period, But ultimately, it has to go back to Reuven. And in
No
the
matter
Jubilee year, it has to go back to him.
even no matter how many times it's been sold, it
Correct.
ultimately goes back to the. So what
Right.
it's not in that case they have to like keep records forever, right? To
Right.
figure out and I'm sure we're going to get into this, but what happens if there was nobody left, from the original family for it to go back to, right?
Right.
At that point.
Very good question. So there are the laws of inheritance, and it may be that we're going to go into that. But I think that's when we deal, I believe, in the book of Numbers with the daughters of Tzlavchad, because Tzlavchad didn't have any sons in which to inherit his land, okay? And so the daughters go, this is again another example of oral law in the written Torah. And in other words, circumstances alter cases. So under normal circumstances, the land would go back to the male members of the family. But
Right.
here in a case where there were no male members, that Slavchad he only had daughters, it goes back to the daughters. The daughters are the ones who inherited in that particular circumstance. So the Torah goes into the whole laws of inheritance. So that basically it starts off with if a man doesn't have sons but he has daughters, it goes back to his daughters. And there's also a little knach, you might say, there about the daughters marrying outside. So they're not allowed to marry people outside of their tribe. They have to marry people within the tribe so that the land doesn't move off out of the tribal holding. But let's go back now. So under normal circumstances, let's suppose a man has no children at all. In that particular case, it goes back to his, if I'm remembering this correctly, it would be if he dies and he has a father who survives him, it goes back to the father. If his father doesn't survive him, I believe it goes back to his uncle, right, his father's brother. And if neither the father nor the brother, if in other words, he doesn't have fathers or uncles that have survived, it would then go to his first cousin. In other words, the children of his uncle. And that's the way the inheritance stays within the same family.
Wow. Okay.
Right. So we will have to wait until we get to the Book of Numbers back in there and see if we're covering it. If I'm not mistaken, the stories of the daughter of Slavchad occurs in two different places. But it discusses at that particular point these laws of inheritance and how the inheritance passes. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for asking the question. So I'm going to stop the share. And if there are any other questions at this point? No. All right. Okay. Very good. Oops.